We are talking about the period during which the Holiness movement began to become a distinct movement in the sense that churches began to form out of the groups of people that had been converted at home, and I say at home here in the United States where the movement had its origins mainly, and around the world. Because by this time Christianity was very much a worldwide movement, the end of the 19th century, and was increasingly so. I remind our listeners again and the students here that in the 19th century, Christianity literally exploded around the world for many different reasons. One of them being, of course, the fact that the channels of communication and the possibilities of getting around the world were becoming more facile every day so that people could get there and get back and the communication could continue. And, of course, the big thing was that the church was driven to send out people to preach the gospel. So the first three churches, the radical holiness movement, I have given you. And I've not gone into a lot of details because the names will not mean a lot to us if we don't have background in it. But I will say that these three movements all today are part of the holiness movement. The Holiness Church of California became part of the Pilgrim Holiness Church in 1946, a small group still. The independent holiness churches in Missouri are still in existence and have their headquarters near Kansas City, in Overland Park, Kansas. And the Church of God Anderson, of course, is one of the larger holiness churches, larger than either the Wesleyan or the Free Methodist Church, and are still consider themselves basically a different kind of denomination, not in any prideful way, but they have a different approach to it, and that is basically still they think that the church ought to be united under one banner, and they make union a very important part of their understanding of themselves. So that's where we are. Now, quickly, because we have this tape and another one remaining, we want to touch on ourselves. We've been working down from this mass church movement. We've been talking about the whole church, the Catholic Church, and on down. We came to Methodism as a holiness church. Then we came to Methodism when holiness movement became a contentious factor in the church. And we come up to 1880s, we begin to get the point of division. About a generation later, by about 1900, in fact just before 1900, a second wave of holiness people begin to leave their established churches. Not only Methodism, but Presbyterianism and Baptist churches, because there are holiness associations in all of these churches, or they are in the holiness associations. And some of the significant leadership of the Pilgrim Holiness Church and of the Nazarene Church and of the Church of God Anderson are people that came out of non-Methodist churches, some of them. Mainly Methodist leadership, but some of them are non-Methodist. And some of them Presbyterian and some of them Baptist. And so we're coming up now to a second wave. The holiness people found a bitter experience in their first successful crusade, which was from 1867 on up until 1877, about 10 years. A tremendous number of new people were born again. As we said before, preaching the holiness message does not quash bringing people to Christ. It enhances it if you give it as the real goal of the Christian life. You open up the possibilities of a life with Christ. And so hundreds and thousands of people were converted. But they didn't have any place to go. But still they fought to stay in the church. Men like Brzee, who was a prominent Nazarene pastor, men like Seth Cook Reese. Seth Cook Reese was a prominent Quaker, and all of these people, some of them were prominent Baptists and so forth, they all thought that they could keep the holiness movement within the established church lines. But in the last half of the century, America was blowing apart, if you'll allow that term, culturally. America was blowing apart spiritually, religiously, and to be an American church historian, as I was beginning to say at one time, I have a tendency to go off, but I'm back. As happens, at first it was just these few churches in America, and you could study the history of American religion by studying the Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians, Congregationalists, and Episcopalians, and eventually and Roman Catholics also, and I've left a few out, but that's basically it. After 1850, it just goes boom. And you get all these little parachurch groups, revival groups, holiness leagues, which is what Martin Wells Knapp had as the beginning of the Pilgrim Holiness Church. All of these things suddenly come into being, and you don't know who's what. And of course, the older churches are baffled, as we are with the Pentecostals, when there's a great revival movement. Things were happening, they didn't know what to do with it. And the younger churches were saying, well, why do you pick us out and say, we can't start a church? You started a church. Wesley started a church, and just because he started 200 years ago doesn't mean we can't start a church in 1880. And logically, of course, they were right. They didn't feel like they were splitting churches. But actually, of course, in local congregations, they did cause division. Any revival movement also always has two elements. It has a unifying element, and it brings a lot of people together around a new cause from all different churches, and then it has a divisive element. Because when it goes back to the old wineskin, which was a common form that was used for this and still is, Howard Snyder, one of our Free Methodist holiness scholars who's now at Asbury, Howard Snyder wrote a book on the wineskins, in which he says that the new revival movement is difficult for the holiness movement to accept because we are now begetting an older wineskin. And you know the parable of the wineskin is that when it's soft and pliable and new, it can give. But when it gets to be kind of like old leather does, hard and cracked, it doesn't take much change. And Christ, of course, used that illustration from the old picture of Palestine and the wineries that were there. And so it was a devastating time for American religion. But for, of course, the holiness tradition, it was the beginning of days in the sense of becoming part of the organized pattern of religion in America. And so, about the 1890s, we have a second wave come out, another 10 years or so after the first wave. And this time, it is not so much come-outism as Timothy Smith, the historian, has told us again and again. It was put-outism or push-outism or whatever you want to call it, force-outism. Because in the powerful Methodist Church, where the bishops still had a lot more power than they do today, as Bishop Chamberlain would remind you quickly, they have a lot more power. They and the district superintendents and the conference superintendents began to assign holiness ministers to small charges, put them out in podunk centers somewhere where they wouldn't be influential in the church. And I'm speaking very broadly here. This certainly was not true of all Methodists. But in certain critical key points, this was done, enough so that the holiness movement began to feel like Methodism no longer welcomed them. Now, for some Methodists, that just got their dander up. And they said, we're going to stay with the church, like it or not. They'll just have to swallow us. But not everybody's made up that way, especially people who are new converts. And you'll find that the Methodist movement or the holiness movement of the 1900s was basically perhaps where we are today in some movements. It was a group of young people and young couples. As I look back, and if I use a personal illustration, on the church at Cherryville, my father was a United Brethren minister, just a young minister, 18 years of age when he took his first two charges in the United Brethren Church. And so when I was born a United Brethren. My mother was an evangelical. My father was an evangelical, but he became a United Brethren minister, to show you what. And my mother came out of the United Brethren Church, and therefore my father became United Brethren because my mother was United Brethren. But at any rate, we were evangelical United Brethren long before the two churches joined. Now, but when I look back on the Cherryville Church, which is now one of our good-sized Pilgrim Holiness Church, our Wesleyan churches, one of our good-sized churches, and I look at the people I knew when I grew up lying under the pews there sleeping while my dad was preaching. Well, that's better than being loud because I didn't get disciplined for sleeping. And so when I was there, I knew all the original members of that church, which was formed in 1925. I was a year old, and I got to know all of them in my life. And I find out suddenly, I looked on them as old people then. But you know who they were? They were young couples with their children, young children, and single brothers and sisters, and a few grandpas, like my grandfather Dieter, who was always active in the church, that were there. And what I'm saying to us is that we have to be careful that we don't get a church in which we don't have that kind of people involved, because then we will become, and I fear because I have to talk about Methodism so much that I'm looked as being totally negative on Methodism. That's not true at all, because I've had a close relationship with the church, and I know the church well, I think. But the simple fact is, the average age, this is statistical fact. I'm getting a little tired with 8 hours of lectures. But a statistical fact is, and you may correct me here if you can, about 60-some years of age is the average age of the Methodist population today. And so when I talk about old wineskins, this is part of the problem. It's part of the problem. And we don't look at the Methodists because I have friends again and again who have with me shared the history that we're talking about. And once in a while we will say, well, we're about where the Methodists were. Bang, at some point in history, in the way churches develop. So some of our effort in this meeting is to see that we don't play up history per se, but that we find from history what it was that made our churches vital churches, so that perhaps, and this is what many Methodists are doing as well, that perhaps they can find these things and kind of get them back in the gene stream so that we can have fruit from it and be useful. And we're going to talk in the last tape a little bit about where do we go from here, what might we do. So, at any rate, when these churches came along, they didn't find a home, many of them, any longer. Now, I want to quickly say that not all of it was sanctified division. As an historian, I was trained to look at both sides of the question, and I try to do that. And that's part of my job. There were some people who would rather be a big frog in a little pond than a little frog in a big pond. And if they went out and started their own church and everything like they liked it, it was great. Now, that was part of it, and that was a criticism which came to all revival movements and to all independent movements. But I want you to know that most of the holiness people were not independent people. They were church people. As far as I can tell, there is no revival movement that ever started in the 19th century, and I might say in the whole church perhaps, but I'll say the 19th century because I'm probably wrong in the whole church history, that stayed inside the church with such an active movement. And when I say inside the church, I mean inside the established denominations, inside the established framework. There was no revival movement that stayed inside the church for almost 100 years. So for almost 100 years, there were no holiness churches. There were churches in holiness associations in churches, revival movements in the church. So they were not come-outers. They were not come-outers. It was very reluctantly and under very special circumstances that most of the holiness people left. But again, I want to say not all of it was sanctified division, if there is such a thing. I think splitting a body of Christians for any reason is the most serious thing that's ever done. But as long as we have the nature of religion and we do it as human beings, there are going to be at times places where we no longer find a home in the church we're in, and changes are made. And today as Americans, it's not a big problem. We don't have a lot of splits today because you just move over to the other church. Now, as Wesleyans and as holiness people and as Methodists, there's one big problem. If you split a Baptist church, you go and start another Baptist church. But if you split a Wesleyan or holiness church, you probably start some other kind of church. And so Baptists really grow by dividing. And Methodists usually don't, because we take some other name or we take some other emphasis and we don't call ourselves the New Methodist Church. That's not always true, but that is true oftentimes. So enough on that, except to say that it was a difficult period for the holiness people. It was a difficult period for the churches. And this happened all around the world. We're now getting into world Christianity. And to those who may see these videos at other places and in other cultures and other political societies, by this time we are probably touching on issues that affected mission stations in Africa and mission stations in Asia and all around where Christian missionaries from the States and from Britain and Germany were working, and where this movement was working. And so it happened everywhere. It happened in Presbyterianism among the higher life people. Just as today, certain Presbyterians are starting more conservative churches, Presbyterian churches and so forth. You see, it's been happening all the time. So we're talking about something which, unfortunately, is a natural phenomenon in our society, and that is that we still are not the place where we can have that millennial understanding of one church. We always have to try to get together at every point and be as liberal as we can in meeting other people, but the simple fact is, under our circumstance we have now, I think until the Lord comes, we are always going to have different groups that are not always separated because we are not Christian or feel we're not Christian, but because of other issues, which I'll talk about a little later. So, I want to give you several dates now. In 1895, Phineas, that's a good name you can remember. Good biblical name, but we don't use it much anymore. Phineas Bresee, B-R-E-S-S-E. Is that it, Doug? One S, two E's. Okay, I thought I was something wrong there. Talking to a good Nazarene here. Now a good Methodist. Okay, Phineas Bresee had been a rather prominent pastor in the Nazarene church, first of all in Iowa, and then had moved to California, as many people were doing at that period. And there he had one of the leading churches in the conference and was a trustee and founder of the University of California, which was a Methodist institution. And he was very influential in the founding of the medical school at that university through his friend, Mr. Day, I believe it was. And the Methodists gave him positions of honor, but that was under a bishop who was favorable to the holiness message. And during the course of his ministry, and this is an illustration of what happens and why the Nazarenes sometimes been very critical at this point of come-outism and put-outism, a bishop came in who was not favorable to holiness, and the holiness movement in the church at least. He was not favorable to the holiness movement in the church. And the result was that he did not follow along with what Bresee felt he ought to, as appointing him into places he thought he ought to go, not in a selfish way, but he was just put in places and decisions which he didn't feel he should make. And he wanted to go into mission work, and he wanted the approval of the church to go into mission work, Peniel Missions, which was a holiness missionary society. He was a member of the CHA, of the Christian Holiness Association, at that time, or the National Holiness Association, as it was called. At any rate, he came into conflict with the system. And the system at one time was favorable, at another time wasn't favorable. And he was not allowed to go into the mission work, and eventually he did so. And the result was that and the system at one time was favorable, at another time wasn't favorable. And he was not allowed to go into the mission work, and eventually he did so. And the result was that he was disciplined to the point that he felt he had to leave the church. And he left the church and started his independent church. And to show you how Pentecostal they were in the pre-Pentecostal times, he called it the Glory Barn. You see, the Glory Barn. Because there was so much of the life of the Spirit and evident, and in the sense of the response to the Spirit, that it was called the Glory Barn. Now that alone might seem to us today to put him in a pretty radical position, but he was not. He was very much a centrist, but he was with the new movement. In other words, the Holy Spirit was making a difference in his ministry and in the people he was meeting. And he was reaching people who were responding to a place where they could be open to God in a new way. And so the Nazarene Church doesn't date its official origins to the Church of the Nazarene in 1895, but that is the first group that they pick up, which in a series of mergers, finally, I'm not sure, I think it's 1907 or 1908 that they take as their official anniversary date, and they have had their anniversaries according to that date. But the Church of the Nazarene, of course, went on to become the largest of the holiness churches. One of the reasons it did was because it carried with it a lot of the members of the old Methodist National Holiness Association. So the Nazarenes got a very highly trained ministry and administrative understanding. And the mission of Bresee really was, when he left the church finally, when he made the decision to go out under the stars, as he said, all alone, was to bring all of the holiness people together in one church. It was another vision of unity. Warner had this, and his vision was a kind of vision of the future. Brazil's was a vision of the present and Reformation. He wanted to bring all the holiness people together in union. And that's important for our movement. There was a lot of interchange between the Pilgrim Holiness Church and the Church of the Nazarene, and a lot of accusations thrown back and forth because they were both working in the beginning with a group of people who were not committed. And so the more larger and sometimes more powerful in leadership Nazarene church would come in and pick up an Apostolic Holiness Church, which was the name of the Pilgrim Holiness Church at that time, and they'd take the leadership and the people and make them Nazarenes. And I mean make them, force them, but they got them convinced to come into their movement. And of course the AHC, the Apostolic Holiness Church, would call that sheep stealing, just like other people accused us of proselyting. So there was tension, but it was always a family tension. It was always a family tension. And as some of you older ministers will know, over the years the Nazarenes and the Pilgrims slipped back and forth into each other's movements because they still were movements that were brothers and very close to each other. And today, of course, they're major parts of the joint movement of holiness churches. So 2 years later, and now we're going to get to our Wesleyan history side of this a little bit more in detail. 2 years later, Martin Wells Knapp and Seth Cook Reese and C.W. Ruth, who was a leader of the old Heavenly Recruits in Pennsylvania. By the way, for historical interest and accuracy here, and since it's on tape, I want to say that probably we ought to add the Heavenly Recruits to that 1800 list. Because this organization, a small organization in Pennsylvania, right near us here in Philadelphia, in this area, they organized about 1880 as the Heavenly Recruits. They were an evangelistic organization, urban-based. You see, holiness was not a rural movement in its beginnings, it was an urban movement. And they were urban-based in Philadelphia, coming out of the many revival movements which had gone through Philadelphia and holiness movements which accompanied them. And this is the church that some of you here have been affiliated with, possibly. I know many of you. This is the group that later became known as the Holiness Christian Church. It became known as the Holiness Christian Church, that's right. Brother Brooks was a part of that. And so this is another 1880 group that was one of the first to become distinctly holiness. They have since merged with many groups. A group went to the Nazarenes in 1907 out of this area. A bunch of Holiness Christian people stayed, Heavenly Recruits and Holiness Christian. In 1919, the Indiana district and the Missouri district and other districts in the West all became part of the Pilgrim Holiness Church. This is one of the big things that strengthened the Pilgrim Holiness Church in the Midwestern part of the United States, right around where our headquarters were. And that was the addition of the Apostolic Holiness people from God's Bible School and its center, and the Heavenly Recruits, which joined there because the church was getting bigger than its organization. The church was not adapted to move quickly, and so the people in the Midwest joined the Pilgrim Holiness Church to form a stronger union and a stronger body. So these men, Martin Wells Knapp, C.W. Ruth, who later became a Nazarene. That's why we don't hear a lot about him as a founder of the church, but actually C.W. Ruth, along with Seth Cook Reese and Martin Wells Knapp, all of whom were at the meeting in Cincinnati in 1897, they are the founders of the one half of the Pilgrim Holiness of the Wesleyan Church. And out of that, eventually, around God's Bible School, and let me give you a little bit of background without getting too much in detail here because it's local historical interest. God's Bible School is the place where is the milieu in which the Pilgrim Holiness Church, or Apostolic Holiness Church, and many other names in the beginning, grew. But gradually, the school, which was an entity and separately owned, and the church, which was a church organization and eventually became a denomination in 1913. They called themselves a church. Before that, they were just a holiness association. In 1913, they grew apart. They didn't, not that all connections were broken, but officially and organizationally, they divided. But much of our early Pilgrim history has to be found in the development of Martin Wells Knapp's school at Cincinnati, which was a holiness center. He had a school, he had an orphanage, he had missions, he had camp meetings. It was kind of, after he left Methodism, he was a Methodist, by the way. After he left Methodism, he organized one of the great early centers of the organized holiness movement. By the way, this year they are celebrating their 100th anniversary. The school was founded about 1900. They're writing now a history, and I've just read the first 3 chapters of that history for the author to kind of review it and give any criticism I have on it to him. And so the beginnings of the Pilgrim Holiness Church lie in what is still God's Bible School, and now called God's Bible School and College in Cincinnati, Ohio, one of the early centers which trained many Nazarene, Wesleyan Methodist, and later Pilgrim Holiness in name people. It was one of the centers at which much of the holiness evangelism in the East and Central and Eastern Midwest, in the Indiana, Ohio area, especially Ohio, Kentucky, was centered. Knapp was a dynamic person. Knapp tried to go to the mission field. He felt he had a call to missions under William Taylor. See, Taylor keeps coming up all around here. But he had a weak constitution, as they used to say in the history books. In other words, he wasn't exactly healthy, a healthy specimen, and Taylor felt that he couldn't go out and do the work, and he denied it to him. So Knapp turned his energies into a holiness center in which he began to develop new means of propagating the message. He would go, his people, and defend the prostitutes in police court because they were being harassed by the police. Unjustly, of course, not because of their profession or anything like that. But this is where the social holiness comes in. He had many ministries to the poor of Cincinnati. He had ministries for women, young women, single women who were unmarried, homes for pregnant women and single pregnant women. All kinds of ministries were going on. He had a big camp meeting which drew in leadership from all around. In other words, it became a center. If I can draw the picture now, first of all, you have the churches like Methodism, then you get associations, which are evangelistic organizations in which people get together from many denominations and do holiness work, and they're called holiness associations, hundreds of them, all across the United States. But eventually, as we've seen, the holiness associations become more like churches, and people look to them for spiritual leadership and counsel. And so you get this transition from centers like God's Bible School, which are, if you can see a funnel, and they begin to suck in all the little groups that have been all around the United States, and they begin to supply leaders for them, and they begin to supply missionaries for them. And so they become central organizing points. And of course, the outreach is always through the camp meeting. The Pilgrim Holiness Church and the Nazarene Church are always called in history, in American history, camp meeting churches. Because almost everything that happened of significance in their organization and in their development happened when all the people got together at the summer camp meeting. That's where all the people who were leaders in the church and all the evangelists who were leaders in the church got together, and that's where they decided what they wanted to be like. In other words, what their parameters were, what kind of standards they were going to hold, all of that kind of stuff was part of the camp meeting. And some of us grew up there. I'm sure there are other people that, with the age to which people are living these days, fortunately or unfortunately, I'm sure there's that can match it, but I have been in a camp meeting every year of my life since I was born. At least one camp meeting a year. Now that, when I say since I was born, I mean my first year of life. In July of 1925, I attended my first camp meeting service. I don't remember it. At least I don't remember the text. But I just use that as an illustration. The camp meeting was the central element in our lives. Of course, with some of us who grew up on a campus also, eventually, and in educational work, that became very important. But the camp meeting was the organizing center of the Nazarene, Pilgrim Holiness, Church of God Anderson, all of these places. And that's why when we talk about the camp meeting, sometimes we are touching very holy ground. Because for me, it would be because I know the centrality of the camp meeting and how it determined our nature. It's not that I think we can't do camp meeting work in other places. But I've always said that if we replace camp meetings, we have to have something to bring people together in mass rallies in which the people who are influential in the church get together and talk about their problems and their victories and everything else. We need that, or else we lose a sense of corporate memory, or of institutional memory, I better say, although churches are in the United States incorporated institutions. But I don't want to sound commercial, of corporate memory. And oftentimes, I have seen in my lifetime, when the camp meeting went in a district, there were changes which were inevitable in the way the district operated and the atmosphere and so forth. Now, again, I'm not saying the camp meeting has to do it, but we have to see that people of God need the Jubilee. They need the camp meeting. They need the place where they can express themselves in a situation other than in their regular, routine church life. They need the celebration and the sense of doing something as a group. And that's almost, I'm not preaching out of something profound, that's almost so basic that I'm sure everybody has a real sense of what we're talking about when we talk about that. And so the camp meeting was very influential in the formation of these churches. In the early churches, the Pilgrim Church and the Wesleyan Methodist Church, as we talk about it later, the Methodist Holiness movement continued to have great influence because many institutions were around that did not leave the church and became influential in Methodism as well as in the Holiness movement. I call them bridge institutions. When I worked at Asbury for 15 years, I consider myself to be at a point between Methodism and the two movements and other churches, Methodism and the movement, and trying to recognize that we still have common ground if we center around our Wesleyanism. And so the simple fact was that certain elements like Asbury College and Seminary, which is one of the largest and today probably the most influential as a single institution, still taking Free Methodist and Wesleyan and other holiness ministers and preparing them for ministry at that level. But then there were many others. In Chicago, there was CEI, Chicago Evangelistic Institute, which is where Dr. Gonzalez first went to school before he came to Beulah Park Bible School here at what became United Wesleyan. And there was Cascade College in Oregon. There was, of course, Vinard College, what was known as Vinard or Kletzing, and Central Holiness University, as one of our attendants here, his parents went to Central Holiness University. That was where a lot of the old Methodists of the CHA started a training institution. And Taylor, the other most influential at the time was Taylor University in Upland, Indiana. Taylor University today has consciously made itself a more generally evangelical institution. They don't have as strong ties to the movement as they once did. But that's where a lot of holiness ministers in both Methodism and the holiness movement outside of Methodism were trained. That's named after William Taylor. It's named after our bishop that we keep coming back to. And so these institutions kept the flame of whatever they felt they were promoting of this holiness tradition in Methodism alive, and of course have had a hard time many times in the church because they are not official church institutions, and yet they try to keep their life generally within the circle of the Methodist support. And they have received strong support from Methodism over the years, as Asbury can attest to. So the Pilgrim Holiness Church grew out of a God's Bible School and gradually separated. The institutions for many years have been rather separate because we have our own schools, we have our own institutional training centers, but a lot of our older ministers and older leadership were trained at God's Bible School and at Asbury College, which was another part. Asbury College is a rather unique institution. In United States law, if we have an institution for nonprofit purposes, you have to have somebody to whom the property would go if the institution closes. We call it the remainder party or something like that. If Asbury College should ever close, and it's one of the major colleges in the whole movement, it goes back to the NHA. That is the party which, so it's very close ties to the old National Holiness Association. So the Pilgrim Holiness Church developed. It was not very big when it started. In fact, Seth Cook Reese said when he met in 1897, everybody talked about that date later on, he said it was a very little thing. In other words, we just thought we were starting another holiness evangelism society. Now, why did they do it then? Well, we don't know for sure, except that Knapp and Reese were very much involved in evangelism, very much involved in missions, and very much involved in the holiness societies and associations we've been talking about. So their hearts were in it. But I have a theory, which I'll leave a footnote here on. In 1897, A.B. Simpson, who was the founder of the Christian and Missionary Alliance Church, at that time, the Christian Association was a home missions work. The Missionary Association was a foreign mission, as we called it, foreign missions work. And he had these two associations, which were holiness associations. Very definitely holiness, but they were Presbyterian, basically. And so, since there were associations, anybody could join them if you were Methodist or Episcopalian or anything. You put your name on the list. I don't know what a contemporary thing would be. It'd be something like joining the Red Cross. Yes, and a little more serious than that, but a lot of people had associations which they said, if you're supporting what we're doing and send us money once in a while, or you give your time and efforts, you can be a member of this association. They were not clerical lists. They were not churches. But in 1897, A.B. Simpson, too, was forced toward denominationalism. And he set up the Christian and Missionary Alliance Church in one of its early situations. And I have the theory, as an holiness historian, I have a theory that Reese and Knapp, who were both part of Simpson's movement in that broad sense, they had their names on the list, and more than that, Reese was the Michigan leader of the Christian Missionary Alliance group, while he was still a Quaker and a developing pilgrim. You see, he's a good illustration of it. Here he is, both of them. They're members of some missionary alliance, which is a list of names of people who support a cause. And at the same time, the alliance is Presbyterian, Holiness Presbyterian. He is Holiness Quaker, Knapp is Holiness Methodist, and they're both starting a new association. And it's my theory, and I don't know if we can ever prove it because we don't have enough reference material. It's my theory that they were not willing to go into a non-Methodist denomination, because both of them were heavily Wesleyan-oriented. And therefore they did what? Now this is a conjecture. This isn't historical fact by any means that we know, but I just got the feeling in my bones that when Simpson decided he had to organize more specifically, and his holiness was basically Calvinistic holiness, but very close to Wesleyan holiness, so close that they could be part of his association, I think they decided that they would have to start a more Methodistic organization, because Knapp was a strong Wesleyan and Reese, as a Quaker, was a strong Wesleyan. And so I believe the Pilgrim Holiness Church partially resulted out of one of these moves to reorganize the movement. And well, I know they did that, but I think it's because other things were happening in the movement. Now the reason for that is that the Nazarene Church down is in Nashville, Doug, where the group was in the south. Where's Trevecca? Yes, where's Trevecca? Nashville, that's what I thought. In Nashville, there was a center like God's Bible School, in which the people included Christian Missionary Alliance, included early Nazarenes, and included early pilgrims. I want you to see that our churches grew out of this mix. At least the camp meeting churches did, like the Nazarene and the Pilgrims. And so, by the time you come to the First World War, they are just really beginning to become churches. The Church of the Nazarene, about 1908, or at Pilot Point, Texas, is where they take their point. And the Pilgrim Church, 1897, but it was just an association until 1913. And in 1913, it took the name Apostolic Holiness Union and Churches. Now that's a common way that they moved. The Wesleyan Methodists, as we're going to see when they began, they call themselves the Wesleyan Methodist Connection, which is almost an association, like a Baptist association. But it wasn't until almost the end of the century that they called themselves a church, because church implied more intensive organization versus congregationalism. So this is the way it came. And so the Pilgrim Holiness Church picked up little elements of other churches, and eventually the big merger that really gave us our name as Pilgrim Holiness, and I was a Pilgrim Holiness member, so I speak from that side, The Pilgrim Holiness Church finally got its name in 1922, when its name was the International Holiness Church, and it became the Pilgrim Holiness Church because Reese, who had left the movement and gone to the Nazarenes and left the Nazarenes and became a pilgrim, a church which he founded in California, he brought that pilgrim body of California back to the Cincinnati group of the Apostolic Holiness Union, and out of the International Holiness Church, which was Cincinnati, and the Pilgrim Church, which was Reese, we had the major addition, which provided what was the Pilgrim Holiness Church at merger in 1968. And other little additions came in. Some Mennonites came in, a Mennonite group in Ohio. Some other holiness people out of the Methodist Church came in, various missions associations, and other apostolic holiness unions. And out of about 4 or 5 different groups, which we can't take time to outline here, the Pilgrim Holiness Church came together until at the time of merger, it was all known as the Pilgrim Holiness Church. If you local people, we're speaking here in a situation in Allentown, Pennsylvania. If you would look at the old cornerstone of the first building over at the campus which we were commemorating last night and thinking about, you will find IHC, 1921. In 1921, the school here was started by the International Holiness Church, which is the Apostolic Holiness Union, which forms out of Knapp's group at Cincinnati. So that is the one stream. The other stream comes from California and from the Midwest. I mentioned the Christian Holiness Church, the large merger in 1919 with the district there. All of these things, if you can see this kind of funnel again of people coming in. And the 2 main funnels in the holiness tradition are the Nazarenes and the Pilgrims, as far as collecting all of these little camp meeting associations and bringing them under some kind of organization. And for the first time in the census, I believe, of 1920 or so, we have the church mentioned. The Apostolic Holiness Church is mentioned, and statistics are given. About 2,000 some members in the first religious census, which we don't have anymore, but which we did at that period of the various churches in America. Now, if you want to get into the history of the church, you've got to read Thomas's work, the 2 Father and Son, part of the Wesleyan Holiness series of 3 volumes. And you've got to read the good little manual on the outline history of the Wesleyan Church for both churches, which we're mentioning here, and get a lot more detail than that. But I want you to see the dynamics of it and where we came from and what we were doing. I'll not dwell too long on that because I don't want to make it normative, but they were a free people. Pilgrim Holiness Church, we always kneeled to pray, which is very Anglican. We always went to the altar, which is very Methodist and Anglican, because the altar is where you met God. And of course, that goes way back to Anglicanism and Roman Catholicism, where God meets people where the sacrament is. We don't know how Anglican we are, as I've said once before in these lectures. Whenever I went up in the pulpit, and almost all universally, as Brother Massey will know, and other preachers here, we knelt to pray in a moment of private prayer before we got up to preach, and when we went to the pulpit. This was the common practice. The prayer varied in various places. Sometimes it was very charismatic in the full sense of that word. Everybody prayed. I know that was common in the Midwest. When I'd go into Midwestern Pilgrim Holiness Church, the pastor would say, "Now we'll ask Brother so-and-so to lead us in prayer," and brothers and sisters and so-and-sos everywhere began to pray. And as I said at the beginning, I hope God understood better than we did as far as what was being said. But at least he knew we were anxious to talk to him. But that was a little bit of a colloquialism, but it's common in many of the charismatic movements today, and so forth. So there were very strong Pentecostal charismatic elements, and I want to bring that point in right here. The first name of the Nazarene Church of the Nazarene was the Pentecostal Church of the Nazarene. The name of some of the movements that came into the Pilgrim Holiness Church were Pentecostal Holiness Unions. All the literature of the whole movement, including the old NHA movement, by the end of the century, what was on the banners of all the advocates and all the journals and all the papers that were out, and papers were there by the hundreds, and especially 8 or 10 big ones, like Asbury's Pentecostal Herald, Asbury Seminary and College. H.C. Morrison, who was the Methodist, who was the basic figure in those institutions, the Pentecostal Herald. They had Pentecostal services. They looked for the Pentecostal fire. Lord, as of old as Pentecost, thou didst thy power display. Oh, send the old-time fire, the Pentecostal fire. This was a common hymn in the church. You see, it was in the Holiness movement that the concept of Pentecostalism and Methodism and the whole complex of holiness teaching, it was in this movement that the emphasis on the Holy Spirit and Keswick, but it's all holiness. I want you to see that. It's a big movement which went in several different ways, but it's all holiness. And eventually, out of it came the Pentecostal movement also. And as I've reminded you once before, if you look at some charts that people make up, they will put Methodist, Holiness, Pentecostal as if it was first Methodist, then it was next Holiness, and then it was Pentecostal. But that is not very accurate. The Pentecostal movement didn't come out of the holiness churches that were forming as much as it did out of the holiness movement as a whole, this big movement, both Keswick, Presbyterian, and Methodist, and so forth. And as a result, and I'm getting here now into an area we have to touch before we leave, as a result, the Pentecostal movement has holiness Pentecostals and Baptist Pentecostals. First of all, the whole movement was basically holiness. But then with the coming Baptistification of society, there was a group in 1914 who broke away and formed what? The Assemblies of God, which is the largest Pentecostal church, which would be the parallel of the Nazarene Church in our movement, or the Salvation Army. But the Assemblies of God were formed because they did not agree with the second work. They took up what they called the finished work, which was that when you are saved, you are also sanctified, and that from then on you grow in grace. They took away the two works. So the Assemblies of God and the Foursquare Gospel, Church of the Foursquare Gospel of Amy Semple McPherson, and these churches are basically Baptistic Pentecostal churches. They are not holiness. But the problem is they came out of holiness and they're still full of holiness teaching. They're full of holiness practices, as I pointed out in a very widespread article in a book that was written one time. All of their roots go back to the holiness movement, but they decided they wanted to be Baptists rather than Methodists. And I'm not saying that derogatorily. That was the historical choice which was made. And they became very large and they're very influential. On the other hand, another one of the largest bodies is the Church of God Cleveland. Not the Church of God Anderson, which is non-Pentecostal. The Church of God Cleveland, which is the largest holiness Pentecostal church. And they believe exactly like we do and teach Wesley's doctrine very strongly of heart cleansing, but they believe that there is a second blessing which takes care of the power. And this is the influence of Keswick and so forth. And so they decided that there were three blessings which have to come in the Christian life, 3 points of crisis, 3 points of decision. And the one is finally the baptism of the Holy Spirit, which they separate from sanctification. I want you to see that. But if you go to I've spoken a number of times at Church of God Cleveland on holiness. And they've got no problem with that. They know where I stand on tongues as far as accepting it as a biblical concept and so forth. They know where I stand on that. But I've been down there many times. I've spoken to their missionary leaders from around the world. So what I want to say is that we are not the only Wesleyan holiness people in the world. When we talk about the Methodist movement, there's a very large church which I think now numbers 2 to 3 million around the world, especially in South America. They're just exploding. And other places, other people that see this film who are in other places and other cultures will recognize this church around the world. So, and then the other large holiness church is the Pentecostal Holiness Church, which is the church that also grew out of the holiness movement. They too have a second blessing theology exactly like we do. I was with the general overseer. They don't call him a bishop, they call him a general overseer of the Church of God, Cleveland, Tennessee, some years ago, I guess now 20 years ago. And it was their 100th anniversary, so it would have been about 1980. They were started in the 1880s. It's about 1980, about 20 years ago. And we were talking about the church and the anniversary and its holiness relationships and so forth. And perhaps his statement was a natural one because they are definitely a Pentecostal body. They believe in the sign witness of tongues, of speaking in other tongues. But he said, you know, Dr. Dieter, we are not as much interested at the moment in working on the tongue side. We're more interested in working on the holiness side. And that's because the whole church needs to be more interested in working on the holiness side without denying the work of the Holy Spirit in some way and its power and effect in the church at all. So this was a testimony of him that to me that we were working on the same ground, and I found that to be true with that group. And so we are in close relationship with the Pentecostal people, but especially with the Pentecostal holiness people. Now, I can't get into all the issues that brings to us. I'll just make this statement that as Pentecostalism and charismatic teaching becomes more common around the world, we have to be sure that we keep as much input and dialogue with those people as we can without compromising our stance on doctrine and what we think is the biblical doctrine on the issues which separate us. But we need to keep as close to them we can because we need to have input into what, for a time at least, we can't tell, is going to be the most dynamic movement in Christianity, which is still very vital. It's sometimes called they with us, or sometimes called the third force in Christianity. You see, I could put it on the board, but let me just do it in my hands. At the top, there's the old Catholic tradition. In the middle, there's the old Protestant tradition, of which we are very much a part. We're very much Reformed. With all we've said about the Calvinists, we are, just Wesley said, one hair's breadth from Calvinism, and that is prevenient grace, free will. And then, now, all of a sudden, about 1960, when the charismatic movement began to revive, and revive the tongues movement as well, the Pentecostal tongues movement, when they began to revive, Van Dusen, who was head of the National Council of Churches, the more liberal group of state and mainline churches, he looked around and he saw something happening, and he wrote a very significant article which he said there is a third force at work in Christianity, and that is the charismatic movement at that time. And the result was that people began to recognize it, to look for it, and out of that included the holiness movement as a third force, out of that also the Pentecostal movement. But I want you to notice that third force is rooted in all this revival we've been talking about. The general revival of all revivalists, but more specifically, it's rooted in this teaching on the Holy Spirit of the holiness and Keswick movement, which comes out of the Methodist revival, which we're talking about. That's where the general roots lie. So how do we relate to the tongues people and the charismatics? This is a formula which has been used a number of times, which I finally came to, and it's been used to kind of define it for some people, and not everybody would agree with it. I say we are twins out of the same milieu. In other words, we're born of the same revival. We are not far apart. We're almost twins, but we are not identical twins. In other words, we're fraternal twins, or whatever it is for being twin women. In other words, we both are so close to each other, and that's why we fought so much, by the way. Oh, yeah. That's why I used the family terminology in that little analysis. We are so close to each other. We were fighting for the same people, if you want to use the word fight, if you want to use the word compete, or if you want to say we were preaching to the same people and looking for converts, whichever you say. In other words, here was this great mass of people who had been fomented and worked up by the holiness revival, and by the end of the century they were all over the world, and somebody had to come in and give them a theology and give them organization and give them a means of expending their spiritual energies And it was two groups of people who basically did it. Maybe three if you want to count Keswick, but Keswick was both Holiness and it was both Pentecostal. So there were two groups of people, and that was the Methodist Holiness people and the Pentecostal people who were associated with the tongue sign, with the unknown tongue. And so part of our struggle is picking fine points with each other, but not all of it. After all our study and after my constant association with them at very many levels, personally, and I'm speaking personally, we are going to keep exchanging people. We're so close, we always have. When the tongues movement started, Wesleyans in South Carolina lost a significant part of the district to the new fire-baptized church, which was one of the earliest tongues churches, was born out in Iowa and out in Kansas by a group that said, we need a third blessing. They're called Third Blessing people. And his name was Irwin, I-R-W-I-N. They were called the Irwinites. They came to South Carolina through the Holiness channels, Holiness camp meetings, and they preached this third blessing, and a significant part of leadership and others in the Wesleyan Methodist Conference, that's the old Wesleyan Methodist Church in South Carolina, became the leaders of that movement, became the founders of the later movement. And out of that church came the Pentecostal Holiness Church. Vincent Sinan, who is one of the historians, along with some of the rest of us who have looked at these movements so closely, Vincent Sinan, who is a Pentecostal Holiness person, says that when he wanted to research his church, he had to begin with the conference minutes of the Wesleyan Methodist Church in South Carolina, because the people who became significant leaders in one of the earliest Pentecostal churches were right directly out of the Wesleyan Methodist tradition, who had been born in the same revival and circumstances which we are. So there's close connection, not major. Some camp meetings became Pentecostal, which were Holiness camp meetings in Florida, for instance. A whole church, which was the Church of God, Tennessee, that was a Holiness church until 1909. And then after the Azusa Street revival and a few years later, they became, as a church, a Pentecostal church. They were a church just like the Church of God, Anderson. And then they became a Pentecostal church. So you see, there was immense competition in the religious world as to who was going to shape up the theology and the thinking of these people. And so naturally, most churches are not very easily adapted to a Pentecostal message because they're so far from it. Holiness churches were closer than anybody else because we actually called ourselves Pentecostal churches. In 1919, the Nazarenes gave the name up because the Pentecostals became so prolific that they defined the term. We no longer define the term. Now, let me throw this last moment here. When we no longer defined the term, we began to lose our Pentecostalism. And the Pentecostalism that we had in its proper mode as we understood it is an essential part of the doctrine of holiness, because it's the Spirit that is everything, and not only in the church, but especially when we talk about the life of the Spirit, we have to talk about it in the terms of Pentecost. And that's what John Fletcher, the great historian of Methodists, brought out again and again. He said it's the baptism with the fire, which is the final point to which the church has to come, and individuals. So we'll talk a bit more about Pentecostalism in the course of other discussions as we get into Wesleyan Methodism, but that's a summary of why we have been in tension with these people to some degree, as we have been.